Tawari, go ahead.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in and for linking up. My name is Bo Tiwari. You wouldn't probably remember me as principal of the University of the West Indies or as Minister of Planning and Development for this country. But right now, I'm just a concerned citizen looking at our country and worrying about how we are going to navigate into the future. My task is very simple this evening, which is to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers tonight, to allow them to present and to allow two of the three to respond to the principal speaker and feature speaker, Dr. Terence Farrell. And if I can, I would like to facilitate a conversation and exchange among the three. We are doing this as part of the national conversations, courtesy the Trade and Development Unit at the UWI. And I am your host for this evening, Bo Tiwari. Another of my tasks is to give you, the participants, a say through questions and brief comments, and I hope that you will participate fully. So we will proceed with the presentations until about 8 p.m. and then have a broader engagement with all of you on the chat from about 8 p.m. The theme for this evening involves perspectives on the economic outlook for 2023. Our feature presenter, as I said, is Dr. Terence Farrell. He is former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago and former head of the Economic Advisory Development Board. He is highly regarded as an economist for his independence of thought and for his genuine concern for Trinidad and Tobago as a society and an economy, and also in the realm of governance. He has written two books, the Underachieving Society, and We Like It So. And whenever he needs to, or he feels impelled to, he writes for the newspapers in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Farrell will present for about 20 minutes, and he will be followed by former minister in the government of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Kevin Ramnarine, and economist Professor Roger Hussein. And I will introduce both of them properly later. So the floor is now yours, Dr. Farrell, to give your outlook on 2023 and beyond, and you have 20 minutes.
Great. Thanks very much, Bo, for the introduction. And let me start off by, well, first of all, let me congratulate Roger Hossain on his elevation to professor. I wasn't aware of that, actually, and he tells me that that happened last October, so I want to congratulate Roger on that sterling achievement. Let me. I'm going to share some slides, which I will share if I can find. Right, I think I see it. Yeah. Right, can you see that? Are we seeing?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just kind of start off by talking a little bit about what the current situation of the Trinidad and Tobago economy is, where we are. Talk a little bit about global energy markets. I know that Kevin is going to go into a lot more detail on that. I'm going to paint a couple of scenarios for what the outlook might look like over the course of the next year. We're talking about 2023, so I'm not going to go much beyond that. Then I'm going to try and do some projections, not econometric projections, but basically trying to see from the scenarios where the economy is likely to be going over the course of the next year, and then do some kind of assessment. But I want to start with very quickly with discussing the geopolitical and geoeconomic uncertainties which we and everybody else in the world at this point in time is facing. The global situation politically and economically is as uncertain as I could ever remember. We have the war situation in Ukraine, which it is, as we know, is not just about a war between Russia and Ukraine. It is a fundamental geopolitical conflict between NATO and the West, and between an emerging axis, it seems to me, between Russia, China, possibly the Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries, which really goes to how the hegemony within the world economy and within global politics is going to play out over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years. The second issue, of course, has to do with on monetary policy. We know that there's talk about an impending recession or the possibility of recession. Interest rates have gone up very sharply over the course of the last 6 months and are projected to go up again during the course of 2023, which has had implications for the domestic economy. We know that a number of companies here in the insurance sector, in the banking sector, which have been holding assets overseas, including the HSF, by the way, have experienced a significant decline in the value of those assets as a result of the sharp increases in interest rates over the course of the last 6 months or so. We have the issue, which is now the enduring issue of climate change and how that is going to impact the energy sector going forward. There is the COVID-19 overhang. What's happening in China? China has changed its policy 180 degrees in terms of how it is dealing with COVID-19. It has reopened the economy completely. And so we have to see how that is going to play out. And as I mentioned, the emerging China, Russia, Middle East axis, how that is going to gain traction. And I pose these as questions, not as issues that I want to have answers to at this point, but certainly they are important because they have, in some cases, immediate implications for Trinidad and Tobago. But let me then turn to very quickly to what has happened over the course of the last year or so in respect of Trinidad and Tobago. In respect of the energy sector, basically, I'm telling people here who've tuned in that we know what has happened, basically. That in terms of production, that is the output in respect of crude oil, in respect of LNG, in respect of natural gas, that basically it has been flat. You know, so if you look at the charts, if you look at the numbers, that has been the case during most of 2022, and we'll have a look at 2023 a little bit later on. In the case of ammonia and urea, pretty much the same thing, in the sense that ammonia, urea, and methanol production has been actually below capacity for the petrochemical sector. But what is significant, of course, is that prices have increased. Now, prices increased significantly, we know, because of the conflict in Ukraine, so that we saw oil prices spike. We saw natural gas prices spike, particularly in markets in Europe. The European gas prices have just been, quite frankly, out of sight. Japan, even Japan, the Asian market for natural gas has been pretty strong. And even ammonia, we saw ammonia prices get to over, I think it's about 1,500 a metric ton towards the middle of last year. It has since come down, and we expect that it's going to continue to come down. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but we have never seen spikes like that in ammonia. Typically, over the course of the last 10 to 12 years, ammonia prices have ranged from maybe 200 to about 700 at the most. The average price has been around 400. Similarly for methanol. So those kinds of numbers were really quite significant, those jumps. So basically the story here is production has been basically essentially flat, but prices were extremely high. There was a surge in prices, and that's of course the result of that, a tremendous increase in revenue for the companies, tremendous increase in the value of exports, and therefore a tremendous increase in government revenues. And so we can see that in respect of government fiscal operations, the surge in prices of oil, natural gas, and methanol leading to a sharp increase, an unplanned increase in government revenue. Government did not plan for, obviously they didn't plan or forecast the war or the effects of the war, but it tremendously boosted government's coffers in I say, an unplanned fashion, as a result of which the numbers indicate, well, they've announced that there was in fact a surplus in the overall fiscal operations account for the for fiscal 2022. The official number which we had earlier was showing a small deficit of about I think 1% of GDP, but they're now saying there was in fact a surplus. The debt to GDP ratio has declined because GDP in current prices has gone up quite sharply with the increase in prices across the board. We've had, and as we talked about it before, an increase in interest rates rising very sharply, reducing bond prices. And so bond prices fell, but equity markets also declined. The S&P, the Dow, the NASDAQ, everything basically collapsed during the course of 2022 as a result of the Ukraine war and the various kinds of uncertainties that we saw. And the HSF is reported to have lost significant value in 2022. Not only the HSF, I'm saying, but also private companies in the insurance sector, in the banking sector experienced a sharp increase in unrealized losses in respect of their investment portfolios. So, but if you look back, just going back over the last couple of years, what we see is that fiscal adjustment in this country has been dictated more by exogenous shocks than by policy adjustment. So that the fall in oil and gas prices in 2016, 2017, the COVID shock in 2019, 2020, and then the Ukraine war have been the driving factors in terms of the outturn in respect of government fiscal operations. In respect of prices and wages, we know that food prices began to rise during the COVID lockdowns because there was disruptions of the supply chain, higher shipping and transportation costs. Those costs have now begun to come down quite sharply, in fact, and they're getting back to normal from what I understand from talking to folks in the private sector. So although in overall inflation remained relatively subdued, what we have seen is that core and headline inflation beginning to accelerate from late 2021, led by higher food prices. And that acceleration has continued into 2022. So the year-on-year food price inflation as at September, because that's the latest number which apparently the central bank and the CSO have available, was 11.6%, which is a pretty sharp increase. And that's pulling up headline inflation, is also pulling up core inflation. So the big question for 2023 is, does that continue? And we'll have to look at that in relation to what is happening in the global economy and the implications of that for continued increases in prices. In respect of wages, as we know, the data that we have on wages are pretty bad. They're very outdated. It's very hard to get a fix on what is going on in the labor market. The numbers, from my perspective, are not particularly trustworthy in terms of understanding what is really going on in the labor market in Trinidad. Particularly, there are certain kinds of things that we would like to know, certain measures that we need to have, which we don't have. For example, data on underemployment and data on hours worked and so on across sectors. But it appears from the data that we have that real wages have declined over the course of the last few years. And I think that what we are seeing in terms of the reaction of the trade union movement to higher prices and so on is evidence of that. In respect of the external accounts and the foreign exchange reserves, Interestingly, although we had a tremendous increase in export earnings, we also had apparently a matching increase in imports and in capital outflows. So that the reserves number, because as you know, the reserves number summarizes the whole of the balance of payments. The current account and the capital and financial account is summarized by the movement in international reserves. Those didn't change very much between December 2021 and December 22. So what does that mean? So that although we had a significant increase in inflows coming in as a result of higher gas and oil prices, we also had a significant outflow of foreign exchange, which clearly, to my mind, because we don't have the data, we haven't seen the balance of payments across 2022, but we know that the merchandise account would have been in significant surplus. We know that the current account very likely was in significant surplus, and therefore the outflows that would have taken place would have been on capital and financial account. What are the elements of that, and how much of that is capital flight? We know the net errors on emissions number has been extremely large over the course of the last many years. In some cases, the net errors on emissions number is bigger than the current account surplus number that we are showing. And so therefore something is clearly amiss in terms of capturing the data on our external accounts, which needs to be understood. But we are also saying that the demand for foreign exchange, we know, has been suppressed over the course of the last several years. We've maintained what the IMF euphemistically calls a stable exchange rate regime. But we've done that, and we've accomplished that by essentially suppressing demand. The banks sell to the public what is available for them to sell, plus what injections the central bank puts in, and the central bank has put in religiously, except for a couple of quarters where it has deviated from the 100 million US that it has put into the system every month. So the system has had to live with those resources, and therefore that has suppressed demand. And therefore what we saw in 2022 is that as more foreign exchange came into the system, and this would have come in, excuse me, basically through the petrochemical companies who tend to put their money into the commercial banking system, and through Heritage, formerly Petrotrin, which also tends to put some of its foreign exchange earnings into the banking system. The banks, therefore, they got more foreign exchange that they could sell to the public, and they therefore sold more to the public. So we have seen a very sharp increase in sales of foreign exchange, reflecting higher import demand. Obviously, we've seen that there are fewer complaints about people not being able to get foreign exchange in 2022. So the net effect of that is that our foreign exchange reserves essentially remain flat. We know that the HSF has gone down. We don't have any current data on where it is now. The latest data I think that we've seen is probably about June or September. The government has not had to borrow. They did borrow a little bit from CAF, I think recently for WASA, I believe. But essentially, the government has not had any significant borrowing to do because we've had this tremendous inflow of revenue. And therefore, external debt has remained about the same. With GDP rising, or GDP in current prices rising, the debt number has, of course, the debt GDP ratio has, of course, declined, which is in fact a very good thing.
Dr. Farrell, bear in mind that you have 5 minutes more.
Indeed.
Okay.
All right. Just to make a point on you know, we can look at some of these numbers as the things that we see on the surface, but beneath the iceberg, there are a number of things that we simply don't see very well. One of the most important to my mind is the question of investments. We have not produced national income and product accounts in this country for years. We just simply don't know what is the level of investment taking place in the economy. We don't know where that investment is taking place. We have no target rate of investment. We have no target growth rate for the economy. And therefore we have no target rate of investment, and we have no target rate of investment in the sectors in which we want investment to take place. You see, because people could invest in malls if they want, which, well, they essentially consume foreign exchange, but is that where we want investment to take place? But since we don't know what the targets are, since we don't know where we want investment to go, then quite frankly, it's a case of almost anything goes. Crime and violence, I know that Roger is certainly going to talk about that. That's one of his pet topics. Compensation is an issue which this is one of the beneath the iceberg kinds of factors, the labor market, inflexibility, the fact that we have institutionalized inflexibility in the labor market by the way in which we do industrial negotiations are backdated. We are now negotiating for the public sector wages going back to the triennium beginning in 2011 or 2012 or something like that, which is quite frankly, it's really ridiculous. Inefficient institutions all around the place, not working properly. And of course, our weak infrastructure, right? Which our Calypsonians and so on will talk much about during the course of the season. In respect of the global energy markets, I'm not going to spend much time on this. I know Kevin is going to go much more extensively into this. In the short term, difficult to predict what is going to happen because the war is ongoing and because in the middle of what is happening in the short term, we have, in my view, a structural change that is being initiated in the global energy market that is shifting that market towards the East, towards China, that the Arab countries, the Middle Eastern countries are pivoting their supplies of LNG towards China. China is going to be reducing its consumption of coal quite significantly, increasing its production of renewables and increasing its consumption of natural gas. And that pivot, and Russia is going to pivot, I think is already beginning to pivot in that direction, does have implications in terms of how the market, I think, unfolds. And then, of course, we have the climate change factor. So there are two scenarios that I see. One, a fairly optimistic scenario, and I think it is, in fact, in my view, the optimistic scenario is probably, I give it a 65% probability of occurring. In the pessimistic scenario, the Ukraine war continues for all of 2023. It in fact gets worse. The monetary policy remains tight. China economic growth stalls, and we have recession. That's a pessimistic scenario. I don't think it could happen. I don't think that is what is going to happen. I think that the Ukraine war is probably going to end by the summer or the early fall. Why? Because notwithstanding the fact that tanks and missiles are being sent to Ukraine, beneath that, there is activity taking place beneath all of that to end that war, because the war is not serving anybody's interests. NATO is not going to win. Russia is not going to win. Or when I put it this way, Russia is not going to lose. And therefore, a resolution has to come to the war in Ukraine, and it cannot go on indefinitely, notwithstanding what Mr. Zelensky would probably like. I don't think that we are going to have recession in 2023. I think it's going to be averted. We will have a couple more increases in interest rates by the Fed and the Europeans. I think that is going to taper off, and we're going to settle with interest rates. They're going to plateau, and China's economic growth is going to recover. Now, with that, therefore, the projections that I am going to assume is that our natural gas production is going to remain flat in 2023. Because although a lot of activity is happening in the sector, that activity is simply going to offset the natural decline that is taking place in those fields, and we are not going to see any significant increase. So I'm saying 2.8 BCF is what we are going to see in 2023. Natural gas prices are very difficult to predict. As I said, the World Bank is predicting $32 for the European Union and $6.20 for the US. I think that 375 is a good number. The futures market right now is actually below 3. But that's the futures market, and that has to do with all kinds of things with the winter and so on. But I think that the US Henry Hub is probably going to average about 375 for the year. LNG production, 1.4 BCF is what I'm calling, representing about 50% of natural gas production. LNG prices, what is going to be interesting about LNG prices, and I'm sure Kevin will talk a little bit more about this, is that with LNG prices where they are, the net back to Trinidad for selling LNG is likely to be higher than the net back for the petrochemical sector. And that's an interesting situation that we will see how the petrochemicals, how the point leases companies respond to that. Crude oil production, 60,000 barrels a day is not going to get much higher than that. We're struggling now at around 56, 58,000 barrels a day. WTI, I'm calling 85. Morgan Stanley has it at 92.50, which is in fact the budget number. Imported inflation about 3.5%, interest rates 4% for the US 10-year. And ammonia prices are going to revert to the mean, but I think for 2023, we're looking at about an average of about 600. And methanol prices, again, will revert to the mean, but for 2023, we're looking at about 500. So the outlook is for fiscal operations, I'm seeing a small deficit, maybe less than 1% of GDP. The balance of payments, the foreign exchange reserves will again stay flat for 2023, simply because although foreign exchange supply is going to increase, the demand for foreign exchange is that pent-up demand is being released and is going to consume whatever additional foreign exchange comes into the system. Inflation, 6% overall, food at about 8%, because I'm saying at the back end of the year, inflation is in fact going to taper. And growth will be about, I'm saying 1 to 1.5% for 2023. For 2022, the numbers are what the numbers are, notwithstanding recent media releases. What we've seen in the first half of 2022 was a bounce, the COVID bounce from COVID. But the numbers in respect of once the energy sector is flat, it is unlikely that real GDP is going to be growing by more than 1, maybe 1.5% for 2023. So my summary assessment is that we are going to experience low growth in real GDP in 2023. Mainly from the non-energy sector, driven by higher government spending. GDP current prices will grow more strongly, excuse me, because prices are going to be higher. Fiscal operations, a small outturn, small deficit. The external accounts are going to be in balance. Inflation is going to rise, but the rate of change is going to decelerate in the second half, although the removal of subsidies, if effected, will contribute to higher measured inflation. And I will leave this last bit of conversation for the discussion, Chairman, when that time comes. All right. So,
all right. Thank you very much, Dr. Farrell. I won't even try to summarize what you said, but I will highlight a couple of things. You spoke about the geopolitics and its connection with hegemonic control of the global economy. You spoke about monetary policy globally. You spoke about local production of oil and gas and its implication for us here. And you talked about the fact that although there was significant revenue inflows, we also had significant foreign exchange outflows, which we need to understand better. You had a perspective on what is going to happen worldwide, in which you suggested that the war will end. There would really be no deeper recession, as some are anticipating, that China would recover. You said this was the optimistic view, but that TT will have flat production and really gas prices, LNG prices, and petrochemical prices may well determine the kind of revenue scenario we have. There were other comments you made, but and incisive perspectives on the future, but I will leave that to the discussion and go on to our next speaker, who is Mr. Kevin Ramnarine. As a minister of energy in this country, he brought significant investment in energy to Trinidad and Tobago, which has borne fruit, which is bearing fruit, and which will bear fruit in the future, in terms of gas finds and increased production. He's now an active energy consultant who keeps a close eye on energy developments globally and a watchful interest on energy developments in the Caribbean and Latin American region. Kevin Ramnarine would have been involved as Minister of Energy in negotiations on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago with the government of Venezuela on both Dragon and Manatee pre-2015, building on initiatives taken by the Manning administration, but also strengthening the platform for the Rowley administration to continue its work. Here is Mr. Ramnarine now with his perspective on 2023 and beyond with, I would say, a knowledge of the energy sector, which is unique as a minister, as a practitioner, as a consultant, and as an objective observer of what is happening. So Mr. Ramnarine now has the floor. He has 12 minutes to give his perspective and also to respond to anything that he wants to that Terence Farrell raised.
Thank you, Dr. Tiwari, and good night to Dr. Farrell, Professor Hussein, and all the people listening and joining us tonight. My presentation really is now, a subset of Terence Farrell's presentation, because a lot of what I'm about to say, he said already. In fact, it's amazing the level of how similar we are in terms of our outlook for gas production. So let me just share my slide back. And are you all seeing that?
Yes.
I assume,
Yes,
Rebecca, you all right. So, our first graph really, and I have nine slides and I have 12 minutes. So forgive me if I seem to be going through these slides pretty quickly, but the first slide is really self-evident. It's a graph that shows the close relationship between the production of oil and natural gas, which is your blue line. So I've combined oil and natural gas production in one line using something called barrel of oil equivalent. And the orange line would be real GDP for the period 2012 to 2022. And it shows the close relationship between production and real GDP in Trinidad and Tobago. So it really underscores what we know, that production of oil and gas, and more so gas, production of gas and oil, are really what drive and propel the Trinidad and Tobago economy. The next slide really, to me, paints, and I'm starting off to give some context here of the last decade. The next slide for me paints a worrying picture of the way the energy sector has trended in recent years. And this is a graph of employment in the energy sector. And this is CSO data, it's not my data. And it shows that we have the number of persons. I mean, the large conclusion from this graph is that the number of persons employed in the energy sector has more than likely cut in more than half. So in the first part of the graph there, the energy sector consistently employed around 20,000 people on average. Now that's down to about 10,000 people. So where did 10,000 people go, and why are they not employed? It speaks to the fact that the sector is really struggling and has been really struggling in recent years. This is a graph of drilling activity, and you can see the employment graph reflected in the drilling activity graph. The drilling activity has come down significantly in recent years. And this is a graph that we look at. This is what we call a waterfall chart, with the orange bars being negatives and the blue bars being positives. And it shows the movement in gas production in terms of percentage from the year 2010. We're expressing 2010 as 100%. And it shows that in the year 2022, we would have lost 37% of production compared to 2010. So there's been a significant fall in production. In 2010, production was 4.3 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And production is now, we ended 2022 with production at 2.7 billion cubic feet of gas per day. So we've lost about 1.6 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And, you know, in discussing with people in the sector, the question which now arises is, was that 4.3 billion cubic feet of gas per day sustainable? And the answer, of course, is no, it was not sustainable. So it seemed that we created a demand for natural gas in Trinidad, which we couldn't sustain. And that's a whole other discussion that we could have. But what this shows is that if you look at that 37% fall from 2010 to 2022, the majority of that 37% or 24% of that 37% happened in the year 2020 and 2021. So 2020 and 2021 were really bad years for production. And that had nothing to do with COVID. Those were the COVID years, but it had to do with the decline in drilling activity that preceded those years. And that decline in drilling activity, in my opinion, was really driven by the fact that the sector was not properly incentivized to continue the treadmill of investments which are important. Dr. Farrell spoke about price. And of course, you know, we are price takers. The products we sell are sold on the international market. This is a graph of the European natural gas prices at what is called the TTF in Holland, in the Netherlands. And this is the graph for the last 12 months. And it shows a spike in August at around 350 euros per megawatt, per megawatt hour. They measure their gas in per megawatt hour. And it shows now, if you look at the trend in the graph towards December, January, prices of natural gas in Europe have come down to pre-Ukraine invasion levels. So what has been happening is that a number of factors have come together to really bail out Europe from the conundrum it found itself in when it of course allowed itself over decades to become tethered to Russian supply, particularly Europe's largest economy, Germany. What has happened is nothing short of a miracle. Germany has been able to pivot away from Russian gas by quickly building regasification capacity to receive LNG from countries like the United States, from Qatar, and they've also increased the amount of gas they're taking from Norway and from Holland. So Germany has all but replaced, I think they've completely now replaced the Russian supply of natural gas. That's one factor. The other factor in Europe is that the wind capacity has been very good. Winds have been strong in the North Sea. So they're getting more electricity from wind. And the third factor is that the weather in Europe the winter has been mild. So much so that some ski resorts can't do business. So Europe has benefited from the confluence of all those factors. So the conclusion here is that gas prices in Europe are trending down. This is a graph. Dr. Farrell spoke about ammonia prices, and we have 10 ammonia plants. I think 9 now, nine ammonia plants in Point Lisas. And this shows this is 3 prices in one, but of course they're all very highly correlated. It's the Caribbean price, the Middle East price, and the Black Sea price. And around April last year, the Caribbean price, which is, well, the only country in the Caribbean I know that produces ammonia is Trinidad, had reached as high as $1,600 a ton in April 2022. And that is, of course, because there's a global shortage of ammonia. caused by the rebound in world economy, in developed economies from COVID, and caused by high natural gas prices in Europe having leading to plants closing in Europe, ammonia plants. So, but those ammonia prices now are coming down, and whereas they peaked at $1,600 a ton in April of last year, and then they sort of stayed at around $1,200 to $1,000 per ton, they're now down to about $750 per ton. The most recent Foticon data. Still a high price, but we will have benefited in Trinidad and Tobago from those high ammonia prices. In particular, and I was talking to Dr. Tiwari about who exactly benefits from these high ammonia prices. And we would want to, of course, think it's the ammonia plants in Point Lisas that benefit from these high prices, but that's not necessarily so, because the NGC sells natural gas to these ammonia plants, and the price that the NGC realizes for the gas is indexed to ammonia. And the NGC also buys natural gas from the upstream companies, and that price is also indexed to ammonia. So the value would have been spread between the ammonia plants, the NGC, and the upstream companies, BP and Shell and EOG and so on. This shows oil prices also trending down, picking up a bit in recent weeks because China has been reopening its economy gradually. So the conclusion from my short presentation here, and I could come back afterwards in the Q&A, is that our production of natural gas is, I don't think I put in my, I think I forgot to put in my natural gas chart here, Roger. But Dr. Farrell is spot on with the 2.8 billion cubic feet of gas per day. That's exactly the number I got for 2023. It's a slight improvement over 2022. 2022 would have been 2.7. The conclusion really is that and I have run natural gas production forecast out to 2030. And these numbers that go into that are not numbers that I create. These are numbers I get from many different people. What I'm seeing is that even with the Manatee field coming into production in 2027, we will be struggling to get above 3 billion cubic feet of gas per day. We don't know when the Dragon gas will come into production. We don't have a date for that. If that comes, well, that's going to help. But right now, all things being equal, our production is looking as though it will stay below 3 billion cubic feet of gas per day, which is not a good place to be for our sector. Oil production continues what I call a slow march to, the slow march downward. It's below 60,000 barrels per day. It's about 59,000 barrels per day. Oil prices, in my opinion, will range between $70 to $90 a barrel, where it's been. It could go above $100 a barrel, depending on what the Chinese demand will be. Natural gas prices, obviously, in my opinion, will be lower in 2023 than they were in 2022. Government's revenue target for fiscal 2023, which is 56.2 billion, I think will be a challenging number for the government to achieve, given the assumptions they use in the budget. Growth in 2023 will also be challenged by low gas production and oil production. And then finally, I pulled up this before I came on. Brent oil prices have averaged 87.27 per barrel since October 1st, 2022. And this is below the 92.50 per barrel used in the budget. So we, of course, are below the budgeted price for oil for what is now a 4-month period. Henry Hub natural gas prices have averaged $5.14 per MMBTU since October 1st, 2022. And of course, the budgeted price is $6 per MMBTU. And just to qualify that, the price used in the budget is not purely Henry Hub. It's sort of a basket of all the contracts in Trinidad and Tobago, but it's heavily influenced by Henry Hub. So in conclusion, production, I concur with Dr. Farrell. Production of gas is going to remain flat. Production of oil is going to remain flat. And prices, these price spikes that we realized in 2022 seem to be now receding. And I don't think the Russia-Ukraine war is going to last much longer. It's probably going to end in a sort of draw, and it will sort of taper off because wars are expensive things and countries eventually run out of money. So would the Russia-Ukraine war to come to some sort of ceasefire or some sort of stalemate or something, expect prices of oil and natural gas to fall even further. And that could have a significant impact on our economy. So I think I'm within the 12 minutes here, Dr. Tiwari. Hopefully.
Yes, you did. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Again, I won't try to summarize, but simply mention that basically Kevin made his presentation hinged on production and price and the numbers that seem realistic over the period into 2023. And he raised the prospect or the issue of financial viability and economic sustainability based on those numbers of production and possible price with all the factors that impact on these things. And it does raise the big question for us, how do we achieve financial and economic viability given those realities of the energy sector, and notwithstanding significant initiatives that are being taken for transformation of the energy sector, and also the recent good news about possibilities with Venezuela. Thank you very much, Kevin. We move on now to our final speaker for this evening, but not the end of the program. Our final perspective on 2023 and beyond is from Professor Roger Hussein. And you would have heard Dr. Farrell mention that Roger had recently achieved his professorship. It was long in coming. It is something that I myself feel, based on his work, that he should have achieved or should have received recognition for some years ago. But things never happen before their time, and he has done that. And we also congratulate him publicly on this particular achievement. This is very well deserved. Professor Hussein is a respected economist worldwide and regionally. He has worked with or collaborated on projects with the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, the CDB, and has done work on CARICOM and on individual island economies, including Trinidad and Tobago, and has also worked with governments across the region, including the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Because of his deep commitment to this country, Trinidad and Tobago, he has written a great deal about the Trinidad and Tobago economy. He has written on energy, he's written on manufacturing, he's written on services, he's written on the labor market, he's written on tertiary education, and several other sectors vital to the development process. Professor Hussein is strong on applying mathematics to economics and on the importance of statistical analysis, and has made it, one might say, almost his career to track vital statistics and their meaning for Trinidad and Tobago and for regional development. This evening, Professor Hussein will focus on the challenge of recovery and growth for Trinidad and Tobago economy in 2023 and beyond, which is not so easy to achieve. Professor Hussein, you have 12 minutes for your exposition.
Are you all just verifying that you all are hearing me?
Yes,
Yes.
Prof.
Right. So I have Murphy's Law. I'm not getting you to digicel, so I'm using my phone. I have a PowerPoint prepared, but I'm unable to use it. So I will just respond to what Terence said and what Kevin said. Now, very interestingly, I listened attentively to both Terence Farrell and Kevin Ramnarine, and I am assuming they didn't collaborate, and yet still they said basically the same thing. They basically painted a picture for 2023 in which the economy would experience at best moderate growth based upon dormant production activity in the energy sector, given that any super cycle tendencies in the energy sector prices on account of the Russian-Ukraine war may be tapering away. And that's interesting that these two distinguished folks, both experts in different areas, but areas that overlap, would come to the same conclusion. And I think it would be wise that policymakers would pay attention if any of them are on, or if any of them have colleagues that are on, would pay close attention to what these two distinguished gentlemen have indicated, because I also agree with them. And I think the probability that they are correct is very high, a 0.9 or more. Now, one of the things that Terence mentioned and Kevin mentioned was the size of the fiscal deficit. And the Minister of Finance himself mentioned that even with $92.50 per barrel of oil assumed and $6 per MMBTU of gas assumed, that we would experience a small fiscal deficit, if I remember correctly, of about $1 billion. Now, Kevin, I wasn't sure if you use monthly data. I use daily data from October the 1st up to, I think, January the 24th. And for oil prices, I only found 3 days in which oil prices crossed $92.50, but I use WTI, and only about 6 days in which gas prices using Henry Hub crossed $6 per MMBTU. In other words, we may experience a far greater fiscal deficit, other things constant, than 1 billion TT, especially if it is the war, as you all both suggest. I mean, I think the war may last for the rest of this year, but I listened carefully to what both of you all suggested. And even if the war were to last all of this year, but at the same level that it is now, with spring approaching and then summer, it's difficult for me to see, even with Chinese demand, oil prices crossing $100 a barrel, especially if it is some of the Russian oil continues to go to China and India in a format that helps to not put pressure on global prices. So that's something that the government would want to keep carefully in mind, the size of the fiscal deficit, even in the context of the highest prices assumed for budgeted for oil and gas since, as I like to tell my students, since Columbus came. Another aspect of the data is the inflation rate. And Dr. Farrell mentioned the relationship of the inflation rate with wages. Now, I took a careful look at the inflation rate, and the period in which negotiations for public servants in particular are taking place is from 2014 to 2016 and then 2017 to 2019. And if you look at the growth in the overall retail price index between January 2014 to November 2022, when data was released by the Central Statistical Office last week, there was a 32% increase in prices, which if a public servant in January 2014 could buy $101 items, they could now only buy 75 of these items. In other words, there has been a significant fall in the standard of living for fixed income people because of the rise in the cost of living. Now, in particular for low income, fixed income households, it's critical to look at food prices. And food prices increased 67.3% between January 2014 and November 2022. That's so 67.3% is a significant, huge increase, especially for fixed income households, and especially for low income fixed income households. And you will start to see all type of implications of that for these households. You are already seeing it. I don't have numbers on urban destitution, but I wouldn't be surprised if after the 6-year depression period in the economy that you see the number of urban destitutes in Trinidad and Tobago increase. Also in the same time period, healthcare costs from January 2014 to the present increased 45%, and transportation costs increased 28%. And these three areas, food, health, and transport, are a significant part of the food price basket. Now, the minister announced that last year we had a fiscal surplus, a small fiscal surplus, and this year we are likely to have only a small fiscal deficit using his numbers. But all of the adjustments, folks, is coming from the revenue side. All of the adjustments. And so if Kevin is correct, and if Dr. Farrell is correct, and prices do fall on average for the year, less than the 92.50 and less than the $6 per MMBTU of gas, then the gap between revenues and government total expenditure is likely to widen. As I said, the fiscal balance would worsen. Now, one of the things that I tend to pay some attention to in recent time is the murder level. We had 614 last year. I developed a small ARIMA model to forecast murder rates and murder levels, and I got 619 for 2022, so it was off by about 5. But for 2023, I'm seeing a number close to 640. And I mean, it's early days yet, and I hope my model is giving me the wrong forecasted value. But already we are close to 50 murders for January. And what I found a little surprising, I mean, it may not have surprised others, but what I found a little surprising is somewhere or the other, I think I saw that the policymakers, in particular the Prime Minister, mentioned that we will postpone the discussion on murders until March. And I think that the numbers associated with this particular variable are worrying enough to bring it a little forward in terms of immediate discussion. And that murder level is linked, in my view, to the labor force participation rate. And Dr. Farrell was careful in saying that he is not overly confident about some of the numbers he has seen about the labor market. And I express the same concern, because the labor force participation rate in Trinidad and Tobago is about 55%. It's probably the second lowest in the Caribbean after Haiti, or even the third, maybe the third after Haiti and Guyana, or probably only Haiti. And we need to do something about that. And it's important to I would like to see the policymakers take a good, deep, intelligent look as to why the labor force participation rate is so low. Who are the people that are not taking part in the labor force? What are what is the agenda? Where are they from? And how can we help? Because that's something that may be linked to the murder level. Maybe it is that these people are jumping out of the labor market and forming gangs, or just being idle and getting themselves in criminal activities of some sort. And we need to understand that relationship better. If the fiscal deficit were to widen, then it's possible the external debt can increase. And the lower the forecasted, the lower the outturn in the actual price of oil and the actual price of gas, the greater may be the rise in external debt, in my view. So on that one, I think, whilst we all agree on the same direction, I think that I expect to see a slightly greater increase in the external debt. The real effective exchange rate, or the level of external competitiveness, will, although it has improved a bit in the last few years, in the last 3 to 4 years, it came at a tremendous expense, in my view, of a decline in the stock of foreign exchange. And I urge policymakers to look closer, and rather than considering only an internal devaluation, see if there are other mechanisms at their disposal to help improve on the level of external competitiveness of Trinidad and Tobago goods and services. Now, today, or was it yesterday, the CSO released data on second quarter real GDP. And I saw a number of messages circulating that the economy in the first half of 2022 grew 6.6% and whatnot, and that the non-energy sector did grow. I just took a brief look at the data, and I saw that the growth, that the numbers that are circulating were accurate, except that it didn't mention a little detail or some of the details, which is that most of the economic growth for the first half of 2022 were coming from sectors that I consider to be the non-tradable sector, mainly the construction sector, trade and repair sector, and transport and storage. And maybe we would want to have a closer look at that to see if that's the direction we want our economic growth to be going, because that type of economic growth, in my understanding of the facts, tends to be have a perverse relationship with the stock of foreign exchange. What we really want to be seeing is economic growth in non-energy exports that could generate foreign exchange. So, having said all those things, I would close by saying that the structure of the economy, in my understanding of the numbers and what I saw in the medium term, in the CSO data that came out yesterday, is that the structure of the economy is drifting marginally away of what I consider to be optimal from a foreign exchange generating perspective, and from a long-term sustainability in terms of export growth perspective. And maybe the policymakers would want to take a closer look at that. Economic growth for 2023, although the IMF posted at close to, well, for 2022, let's start there, they posted it at 4.1%, and I think for 2023 at 3.5%. I think 2022 may turn out to be close to 3%, and 2023 may turn out to be closer to 2% or thereabout. Either way, one of the things that we should acknowledge is that the economy has moved back to some favorable growth numbers, starting in 2022 and moving into 23 and onwards. Part of that is because obviously we are opening back the economy. So if you open back the economy, you will get some economic growth. And on top of that, though, we would have to work very hard to see what extra oil we can recover, to see what natural gas deals could be made to bring more production on stream, and more than anything else, how we could, in particular, improve non-energy exports. Nothing could be, in my understanding, yes, I appreciate and I welcome the prospective deal that may be signed on the Dragon field with Venezuela and given support by the USA, but I humbly urge policymakers to pay close attention to the non-energy sector, because in the medium-term period, that's where our sustainability will emanate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Hussein. I think the three presentations were very complementary and supplementary in relation to each other, giving us a very broad perspective on the challenge of transformation in Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed the challenge of development itself. This is the period, it is now 8:09. This is the period in which the audience can have their say. Please feel free to ask your questions, to send in your questions, or to make your input at this point. And I will begin the process by asking 3 questions. And I am posing this to all 3 panelists and speakers tonight, and anyone may answer anyone, and they may use it as a conversation point among themselves while you send in the questions or make your comments to them. The first one is that, you know, originally in the post-pandemic period, world growth was projected at about just over 4%. And that has now been recalibrated downwards to about 2.7%. World inflation, they are saying, is now seems to be manageable and is projected at 4.6%. But the IMF also says that 1/3 of the world's economies will be in recession or will get to recession. First of all, do you agree with these kinds of assessments? And secondly, what kind of impact do you think what is happening globally will have on Trinidad and Tobago, notwithstanding what we might do in Trinidad and Tobago? So that's the first question. In the second question is, in Trinidad and Tobago, for 7 years, we have been in decline, and we remain over-dependent on energy. And we can't seem to get clarity on a plan for economic recovery, although the government is optimistic about growth in 2022 and 2023. And now we are seeing the numbers, and they seem to be positive. As senior people who understand the economy of Trinidad and Tobago well, and who understand the region well, and who understand what is going on globally, if you had to give 2 or 3 pieces of advice to policymakers in this country, given where we are now, what would you advise them? And the third question I have is, most of the countries that seem to be making progress in this time, that's to say, in the pandemic and post-pandemic period, are focused on self-sufficiency as much as possible. They are focused on neighborhood trade and investment and exports. They have an emphasis on jobs and income and growth. And they, of course, are focused on the poor and the vulnerable. What is missing in terms of the way we are proceeding in Trinidad and Tobago to get the right mix, to get this country on what you might call a sustainable path? So I will leave those 3 there, and the floor is now open to all questions and comments from the floor. I will ask the presenters if they would engage those 3 questions in whatever form they wish as they wait for the other questions.
Dr. Tiwari, we also have a hand raised, so I can encourage everyone to, if they have a question, raise your hand and we can call you. Currently, we have Professor Anthony Gonzalez with his hand raised. And so if you would like, we can ask him to unmute and ask a question to answer the battery of questions that we have.
All right. Good, Anthony?
Yes, good evening, Dr. Tiwari. And
Hi, how are you doing? Good to see you. And
thank you. Yes, good evening to you and your panel. Yes, I wanted to raise 2 questions. The first had to do with the growth forecast. The growth forecasts have more or less been on the low side. And I was wondering if we don't need some more flexibility here, because from all that I have been reading, from the IMF, the IDB, CDB, and so forth, nobody seems to be very clear on where things are going, and there's so much uncertainty that we cannot really make any proper forecast. So I was wondering whether we should not have had some kind of range, some kind of sort of like 2 scenarios, someone like what Terence was doing, although he didn't really give the growth rates based on those scenarios, but something to that effect, which is to say that if we get a better energy environment where, let's assume the war continues over a certain length of time, there's no recession and so on, we could get higher energy prices and we could possibly get a growth rate of, let's say, 3-4%. On the other hand, if things don't go that way, we could possibly get. So what I'm thinking is really it might have been much more useful to do a kind of range rather than to do a kind of fixed forecast. My second point has to do with the non-energy sector. Both the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Trade and Industry are suggesting that the non-energy sector is growing. Or there's a certain kind of dynamism in the non-energy sector, which we haven't seen before. The Minister of Trade is suggesting that in many areas of manufacturing, for example, things like food and beverages, the wood sector, the plastic sector, iron and steel, and so on. She's showing that there has been some kind of expansion of exports. Although Roger is suggesting that the expansion in the non-energy sector seems to be coming from the non-tradable sector, but that is another issue. The point is that the non-energy sector in terms of exports seem to be growing in a certain way, and I think Terence did suggest some reasons for it, which I believe also to be useful, which is that the fact that it has become slightly more competitive because of repressed wages and lower prices and stuff like that. So my point is basically whether we have factored in the non-energy sector sufficiently in our forecast of growth. Thank you very much.
All right, members are free, the presenters are free to respond.
But maybe I can just jump in and try and deal with a couple of these points that were raised. Let me start with Anthony Gonzalez on the growth forecast. Now, one of the problems that we have here is, as I said, GDP in current prices is going to increase significantly because prices are going up, right? So that you could get 4, 5, 6% increase in GDP and current prices. Real GDP is an index number. One of the CSO publishes dollar figures for the real GDP. I don't know anybody else who does that, quite frankly. With real GDP, what we do is that we have a base year. The base year is 2012. The prices for that year, we take that year, and then what we do is that we move quarterly by production, by output. We don't take prices into consideration. That's real GDP. And that is why if natural gas remains flat, real GDP in the natural gas sector is going to be flat. It doesn't matter what happens to prices. You see what I understand what I'm saying? So therefore, my real GDP forecast is saying 1 to 1.5%. It can't go more than that. You see? Because once crude oil and natural gas remain flat, and because ammonia and methanol production are producing below capacity, remember, we have natural gas production at 2.8 BCF and so on. They are taking roughly half of that. They are producing below capacity. So even if ammonia and methanol prices are high, they can't produce more than what the gas that they get over the fence allows them to do. So we have to be careful about what we're talking about. GDP in current prices could be anything. It could be 10%, 15%. But what we focus on as economists is real GDP, and that calculation is done on the basis of moving a base year by production or output. We don't take into consideration what has happened to prices. So don't be fooled, and I'm saying to this, not to Tony, because he's an economist and he understands this very well, but for the public, we must understand what we are talking about with these different numbers and why it is economists and people who watch these things use real GDP, because that is telling you what is really happening in the economy. So we can have a range if you like. I said 1 to 1.5%, because that's, because we can expect that in real terms, there will be some increase in output in the non-energy sector. On Tony's point about the non-energy sector, let me say that I am completely at idem with Roger in respect of our understanding of this thing. When we talk about the non-energy sector, what are we talking about? Are we talking about government? Government is irrelevant. We're talking about construction. You see, home goods are not relevant. What we need to be doing is setting targets in respect of our tradables and particularly in respect of our non-energy exports. That's what we are talking about. The country is foreign exchange constrained. right? And with a situation as we look down the road, 30, 40 years down the road, we will have no natural gas sector. We will have no crude oil sector. We already have no refining. And so therefore, what does the economy of Trinidad and Tobago look like in 15 or 20 years? And therefore, where are we going to be generating the foreign exchange from to be able to import goods and services that we need? That is what we need to be talking about. And therefore, the targets that we set ourselves, the targets have to relate to not just something called the non-energy sector. That is amorphous and quite frankly, it doesn't make any sense. The targets have to be specific. At the Economic Development Advisory Board, what we said is that, listen, your non-energy exports are currently 15% of your total exports. Let us take that to get to a target of 40% of total exports by a certain date. That's a target. That's measurable. That's something that you can shoot for. There's no point telling me that somebody's producing more ice cream and another person exporting some other thing the other day. And so that does not help me because you have set no targets. And therefore, when you set no targets, then anything is good. You see what I mean? So as a country, our policymakers need to be setting a target. They need to tell the country, listen, what our target is for investment, where that investment is supposed to be taking place. I am not interested, quite frankly, in investment in a mall. People could build 100 malls if they want, but malls don't produce any foreign exchange for us. And it's a free country, so people could build malls. But the investments that we want to see are investments in tradables, and in particular, those things that can generate foreign exchange earnings for us going forward. That's my comment.
Okay, that's a very strong contribution there. Would any panelists care to add anything?
I think that was pretty comprehensive. I would just concur with him that if we are looking for growth based on the classic real GDP that he explained, then don't look to natural gas and oil, because as we both pointed out, that is going to be flat going out. In my forecast on natural gas, even with Manatee coming into production in 2027, gas production is going to stay below 3 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And the reason for that, of course, is that as you bring in new gas production, you have decline taking place in older reservoirs. So you're not going to get the growth from oil and gas in the future as you did between 2002 and 2008 in that period. So where does the growth come from? And it has to come from the non-energy sector.
Okay, Rebecca, any questions from the floor?
Okay, Tiwari, can I add something?
Yes, sure. Oh, sure.
Yes, so I agree with what Kevin and Dr. Farrell said. I would only add one small dimension, and that is the increase in prices we are seeing. Whilst real growth in the energy sector, as measured by production changes, would be flat or probably even negative, the increase in prices means that the higher income in the energy sector and like the higher government revenues means that they could buy more ice cream, means that they could buy more doubles and buy more and visit the mall more often, and probably therefore see a little increase in production in the non-energy sector. But what we have to always keep focused on, and as I tell my students in every sentence, how are you going? What are we doing for non-energy exports? That's where the argument has to be, to drive non-energy export growth. And a welcome development that seems to be going on for a long period of time now is the Point Lisas, this e-tech park in Point Lisas that seems to have some amount of promise for some non-energy export activity. I mean, I wait to see the actual outcome, but that's where we need to be going, more in that direction, thinking non-energy export. So thank you.
Dr. Tiwari and panel, there are 3 persons with their hand up. May I invite Vinod Lachman to unmute your mic and go ahead and proceed to ask a question. Subsequent to that, I will ask Sharifa and then Jai to do the same, and we can probably take these 3 as another round of questions directed to the panel. Vinod, go ahead.
Good evening to all panelists and moderator. I want to make the observation and this the observation made by the Minister of Trade that non-energy exports increased, but she did indicate as well the big component of that was prices and not volume. So there's an opportunity to increase volume and therefore increase production locally for exports. Prices may level off because we are now post-COVID, so there's an opportunity. So the overall increase was, bulk of it was a price increase and not a volume increase. Yes, there was some volume increase, but there's the opportunity for volume increase. So it's an observation and a challenge for manufacturing to go after increasing volumes.
I'll leave it, I'll do it.
Okay, Sharifa, please unmute your mic and go ahead and post your question or comment. Miss Sharifa Hodge, perhaps she has stepped away. Jai, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask.
Good evening, everyone. Through Dr. Tiwari. I have a couple of questions. This first one is for Kevin. Kevin, I agree with you about there's a lack of incentives in the energy sector at this point in time. I mean, you gave a lot of incentives under your tenure as minister for enhanced production. Recently, we have seen another energy sector expert who I think you know very well, Anthony Paul. And he spoke about changes in energy governance to make it more transparent, and another recommendation in order to ensure that local content and local interest is maintained, because there is a view out there that regarding the energy conference that recently took place and has taken place in the past, a lot of play, a lot of exposure is more on the views of the multinational corporations rather than our own local energy cluster. And I find that very disturbing, because it seems that the national interest regarding energy is weighing away. And I would just like to give you on Mr. Paul's comments regarding changes in energy governance where that is concerned, and the openness and transparency needed. For example, why the secrecy with natural gas supply for companies in Point Lisas? Why can't things be done in the open? I mean, we're in the 23rd year of the 21st century, and this kind of secrecy and so forth. And is my natural gas, is your natural gas? That's the first thing.
Well, yeah, I think, I want to say something. The energy sector has become even more of a secret society than ever before. You try to get basic information on what's happening in the sector. It's like pulling teeth. And there is a view that the multinationals have now become overly dominant in this sector and are, exerting a sort of influence. And I see where multinationals are coming together to bid on blocks. And I wonder if that kind of thing could happen in Europe, knowing the laws of the European Union that, abhors monopolies and so on. So I think your point is valid, that there is a sentiment in the sector that the foreign multinationals are becoming too powerful and are determining the agenda of the sector. I think it's something that we need to discuss, because I see things happening in Trinidad that I know cannot happen in Europe.
Thank you, Kevin. My second question is posed about Dr. Hussain and Dr. Farrell. Small question to Dr. Farrell. I'm very impressed with your slide presentation. Is there some way you can make a PDF copy available to participants? It is a very erudite presentation, sir. Now, I'm happy you talked about targets, because the Confederation of Chambers have been having lots of meetings with the Minister of Trade to the point where we felt we were going nowhere, and we seemingly for a year have disengaged, because we are trying to bring a conversation to the table where diversification is important and modernizing the economy is important, digitalization and so forth, and building the other sectors. And yes, your point of targets is quite critical. The thing is, Dr. Farrell, I don't know what is the incentive or what is the motivating factor for us to begin on two parallel tracks. Yes, Kevin spoke a lot about the energy sector and some suggestions what needs to be done. Other experts are waiting. But to me, Dr. Farrell, why modernize the economy when a hole could be drilled on the ground and we will get oil and gas? But that's not the answer. Should we be forcing government, or at least among the private sector bodies ourselves, along with the University of the West Indies and intellectuals like yourself, to maybe host an annual conference or annual discussion on diversification of the economy and a roadmap in going forward? If government doesn't want to participate, let the private sector do it themselves. Thank you, Dr. Farrell.
Well, as a question directed to me, I mean, I agree with you on targets. I would say that you know, winning oil and gas is not just drilling a hole in the ground. You know, it requires a lot of expertise and effort and money, and much of the energy, the expertise, and the money we don't have. So these same multinational corporations are the ones that we have to turn to in fact, to get that done. What I do say though is that if we think that winning oil and gas is hard, and in fact for Trinidad is going to be harder now because we're talking about going into the deep water, and the folks who can go into deep water are really the big multinationals, really the BPs and the Shells and so on of this world. You got the smaller guys, the Canadian companies and so on, simply don't have the kind of capacity to be able to do that. So we are dependent on the multinational corporations. We're going to become too powerful, or not to Kevin's point. I don't know. My perspective is not about multinational corporations being too powerful. Multinational corporations are what they are. They seek their interests. They have capital. They have resources. What is incumbent on us, which goes back to the point that Tony Paul has stressed, is that we need to build the capacity. We need to build the knowledge to be able to negotiate with these multinational corporations on a more equal kind of footing. We need to have built up the Petrotrins and the NGCs to be able to have the capacity to negotiate with these multinationals, and we haven't done that. We need to build capacity within the Ministry of Energy. I mean, Kevin was in the Ministry of Energy. The people who occupy the seats in that ministry, we need to pay them better. They're currently getting civil service salaries. They have no incentive to acquire the kind of capacity, the kind of knowledge, the kind of understanding of the industry to do the kinds of things that Tony Paul has been saying that needs to be done. He's pointed out that the legislation that we're operating with is decades old and needs to be updated. That's not on the multinational corporations, that's on us. And we've got to take responsibility for the place, and we've got to do the things that need to be done in order to be able to negotiate with those entities. And a conference on diversification, I would say, yeah, we could probably do that. The private sector probably could initiate that. But I think that what we need in terms of understanding what we mean by diversification, and diversification does not mean simply growing the non-energy sector. It means focusing on generating foreign exchange to be able to replace energy sector, foreign exchange generated by the energy sector over a period of time. That's how I define it. That's how I think it should be defined. That's how I think it should be managed. And by the way, Kevin is absolutely right. I think, was it Kevin? But that Phoenix Park project I had mentioned in my last slide here, which I will circulate, Jai, that's a very positive development. And I think that my problem though is that we need to have many, many more like that, not just that one initiative. And diversification is extremely hard. It is much harder than doing bid rounds for multinational corporations. Much, much harder. And I think this is probably one of the reasons why the policymakers have tended to shy away from it, simply because it is so difficult to do.
Dr. Tiwari, we have two questions on the floor again. Ms. Hodge, have you rejoined us? Would you unmute your mic and ask your question? And then I'm going to ask Mr. Adam Raful to post his question or comment immediately after you.
Yeah, please proceed.
Sharifa, go ahead. I'm sorry, we're not hearing you. All
Having a
right.
problem with the mic.
Yeah, it seems so. Adam, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
Hi, good evening. My question is posed, well, whoever wants to take it, possibly Dr. Farrell. I'm not sure if you all have been following the RIC consultations on electricity prices. Basically, what we're looking at in the commercial sector is more than 50% increase. We're looking at about 62 cents per kilowatt hour to 67 cents per kilowatt hour. Those are prices similar to what you see in Canada and China, etc., etc. And basically, a lot of, for what people might not know, is a lot of smaller manufacturers, call centers, hydroponic ventures, different things that we need to use for diversification fall under commercial. They do not fall under industrial. I wanted to get the panelists' thoughts on that, and how does that affect our goal of diversification and trying to double our non-energy exports? Thank you.
Who'll take that? Price of electricity and diversification.
You know, I mean, I know Adam very well. I mean, the price of electricity simply has to go up. You know, and my views on these matters, I suppose, are not going to be very popular. I am an economist, and I believe that markets and prices tell us something. That markets and prices tell us how to react as consumers, and they tell producers how to react as producers. When we subsidize prices, as we have been doing with water and electricity and so on, we distort the market, and therefore we distort people's behavior. When we subsidize the ferry service, we encourage people into overconsumption of those services. Our fuel prices in Trinidad and Tobago have been extremely low for a very long time because of this side notion that is about our oil patrimony and something, and you have to give something back to the price of something is $10, then the price should be $10 and people should pay the $10. What you then say is that, listen, if there are vulnerable people who should be identified, who need to be subsidized or who need to be assisted, the government should target those people and give those people grants or whatever it is and so on to be able to, for them to have a decent standard of living. But you don't distort your markets for water, for electricity, for all of those things and so on, because you want to subsidize the entire population. What then happens, as economists well know, as we have done with the fuel prices, it's a regressive subsidy. The people who are rich in the society have benefited more from the fuel subsidy than the poor, who we say we are doing it for. And we have all of these subsidies in the country across a number of things, including, by the way, for Adam, there are subsidies which businessmen in this country have been enjoying, subsidies, peppercorn rates for all kinds of industrial estates and so on, and they don't talk about that, but you know, all of those things need to be changed. I'm not saying that there should be no subsidies at all, but I'm saying that subsidies need to be targeted. They need to be time limited. Any subsidy the government puts on in a budget should be for a certain period of time. You review it, and if it is no longer necessary, then you stop it and you let the market price prevail. And the same, Adam, I'm very sorry, has to apply to electricity. And we need to pay the market price for electricity in the country. That is going to prompt certain kinds of behaviors. We have an agenda, as Kevin could probably talk about, in respect of what we need to do in respect of energy conservation and energy efficiency in this country. That can only happen if we get the price of electricity up to change people's behavior, how we consume and how we use electricity. That's my views. It's not going to be very popular, but I'm not a politician. I'm just an economist.
Well, I just want to add that, you know,
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sorry?
Can I ask a follow-up there?
Sure, Adam.
Okay, so my question was, and what I raised at the RIC consultation is when I looked at the financials of TNTech, they were paying, they had an operating profit in the sense that their revenue was higher than their expenses. But the reason why they had a loss of $1 billion a year, which I agree is unsustainable, was partly because of depreciation, which you have to account, and also because of the debt that it carries, of which it owes NGC maybe about 3.7 billion, and the government or state entities owe TNTech over $1 billion. So my suggestion to the RIC, and I don't know if Kevin might be able to explain on this, is can they refinance the debt, maybe approaching the Andean Bank, the IMF, the IDB, Caribbean Development Bank, etc., to try to reduce their interest rates, the interest payments, and also netting off the government, what government is owing TNTech, and what TNTech is owing NGC.
Well, the issue of TNTech owing NGC money is a perennial issue, which is something that I had to grapple with as Minister of Energy, and my predecessor ministers of energy had to grapple with. TNTech has always had this problem of paying the NGC. And what happened is that with the changing international accounting standards, the NGC's auditors became more and more intolerant of NGC carrying that debt for too long. And of course, the auditors wanted to impair the debt. And when you impair debt, you know what happens, Adam, as a businessman. It goes onto your profit and loss statement, and it could show up as a loss. So different governments have had different ways of dealing with that debt. I think that there was a recent restructuring of the debt a couple of years ago, and part of the debt was amortized over a long period of time, but the debt always keeps coming back because TNTech always finds itself it finds it difficult to pay NGC. On top of that, the gas which NGC sells to TNTech is subsidized gas. And this is something which comes out in the Joint Select Committee meetings of TNTech in the Parliament. So the NGC is losing in two ways by selling gas to TNTech. One, they're selling the gas to TNTech at a subsidized price. So they could have taken that gas and sold the gas to ammonia plants and make a lot more money. And two, on top of the fact that the gas is subsidized, TNTech still there's always a problem with paying NGC for that gas. So at the end of the day, the NGC really, over time, is really what was propping up TNTech. Gas, the purchase of gas and the conversion of that gas to electricity accounts for about, I think, 50% of TNTech's expenditure. And the other 50% would be, the cost of running TNTech, transmission, distribution, salaries, depreciation, debt servicing, and so on. So really and truly, TNTech has not had a rate increase since 2009. But the costs have been going up, and the price of natural gas too that TNTech buys has an escalator in it. So the price of natural gas has been going up, although it's subsidized. So we are reaching a point a breaking point with TNTech. And I think if TNTech doesn't get some relief in terms of the price that they fetch for the electricity they sell, then we will go back to the 80s when we had unsustainable TNTech and we had blackouts and so on. And I mean, I don't know how many of you all travel the Caribbean, but TNTech, in my opinion, tends to be one of the more reliable electricity companies in the CARICOM region. And I think as a country, we need to keep TNTech like that. I mean, TNTech is not perfect, but I think compared to their peers in the region and probably beyond the region, into Latin America and so on, TNTech is a pretty well-run company. I know that there are people who will disagree with that. So I think that TNTech the RIC has a very difficult job on their hands to strike a balance between a viable TNTech and protecting the commercial customers like yourself. And I think the RIC recognizes the need to protect people who consume 400 kilowatt hours or less, which would be very small customers, you know. So it is a balancing act, and it's something which I intend to contribute to that discussion as the RIC consultations go on.
Okay, Professor Hussain, would you like to make any comment on any of the questions taken, presented so far?
Not specifically. I mean, Terence put it very clear. I mean, we can continue with a situation where all of the energy revenues are spent out on transfers and subsidies. And I mean, we collected 300 and I looked at the numbers. The amount of money we collected in energy revenues from 2000 to 2022 was by far superseded by the amount of money we spent on transfers and subsidies. So it's an absolutely ridiculous situation. And unless we bring our situation to some intelligent point in which transfers and subsidies are cut, and we allow people to function in an environment that is not subsidized, and therefore wouldn't create a backward bending labor supply curve, a perverse impact on the labor market, adverse impact on the real effective exchange rate, we will continue to struggle. In fact, we created the incentive structure for non-energy, non-tradables to boom in relation to the non-energy sector. And so, slowly but surely, we have to correct that. What I would say is that in reopening the economy, as we are doing now, and as we have done over the last year and a half, we have to be very careful. Yes, we take the malls and we take the shopping plaza and we take the Starbucks and the rituals and those stores, we take them. But it is critical that we also create the right balance in terms of capital injections by the state that can help to crowd in private sector investment, be it domestic or foreign, in the non-energy export sector that could generate foreign exchange. So some of that have been said by both Kevin and Terence. I didn't see the need to intervene, but given that you asked me, that's what I would ask.
All right. Are there any other questions on the floor, Rebecca?
Yes, Dr. Tiwari, the last round of questions are taken from the chat itself. So to Dr. Mr. Kevin Ramnarayan, a question is posted to you. How much more gas can we expect from Dragon? A question that is posted to Dr. Farrell is as follows. With respect to the US exemption allowing the Trinidad and Tobago government to proceed with the negotiations with Venezuela on the Dragon field, do you think that the US and Europe are planning for a new era of international trade without Russia? And a final question for the panel is, how does a long-standing monopoly like TNTech receiving subsidized gas from NGC still not make a sufficient profit if it is determined that the majority of TNTech bills are not being settled by the government and certain industries? Then why make the general public pay more? So those are the last three questions, Dr. Tiwari.
Okay. Who would venture first? Kevin, you want to try?
I think there was a question on Dragon. What was the question on Dragon, Rebecca?
What was the proposed, or what are the expectations with regards to production from Dragon?
Well, I just know what the Prime Minister says. He says we could expect a production of 350 million cubic feet of gas per day, which is about 10 to 12%, about 12% of current daily production in Trinidad. They have not given a time frame as to when that gas will arrive in Trinidad. So we don't know. We could just make some educated guesses. So, you know, we can't say with certainty. So in my, for example, in my forecast to 2030, I can't include Dragon because I don't know when it's going to come to Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, I have said to the Newsday that if I was to give a reasonable guess, I would say 3 to 4 years, right? All things being equal. So that's about all that we know at this point in time about Dragon. There was another question about Dragon. Or was that the only thing?
That was generally the only thing that is targeted to you. Yeah, the second part of the question is targeted to Dr. Farrell and really talks about whether or not the opportunity of negotiating with Venezuela on the Dragon field is really a changing geopolitical aspect in terms of the US and Europe orienting itself to trade without Russia.
Well, I think maybe Anthony Gonzalez can answer that question. He's a relations expert rather than me. What I do see happening is that there is a reorientation taking place in respect of geopolitical situation, and that what I assess to be happening is that Russia and China and increasingly Saudi Arabia under MBS, who is effectively the leader of Saudi Arabia, that they are realigning global politics and economics. The objective of all of that is to reduce, to diminish the US hegemony, to reduce US extraterritoriality, so that where they can punish people who outside the United States and so on, they do all of these things and so on, they have a long reach, that these countries are determined to make a change in that situation, and also to reduce what has been described as the exorbitant privilege of the United States dollar in world affairs. So I do see that happening. And I do see those countries are intent on that. I see Anthony has his hand up, so maybe we can let Dr. Gonzalez weigh in on that question.
Sure. Professor Gonzalez, you'd like to make an input there?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think what I've observed is a change in the geopolitics of oil and gas. I think essentially what we see as a result of the Ukrainian war is that Europe wants to reduce its dependence on Russia. Europe has been overexposed to Russia. I mean, if you see the kind of dependence Europe has on oil and gas from Russia, you'll see where the problem really lies. So they have been shifting away now from Russia. And in that context, I think this is where Venezuela comes in. The Americans need Venezuela to increase its oil and gas production in order for the supply to increase to assist Europe in that process of diversification. So in that context, I see Trinidad and Tobago benefiting from that particular license. But there's a broader question on this issue with Venezuela that I just wanted to raise. I think to some extent, we tend to have a very negative view of ourselves with respect to our neighbors in terms of oil and gas supply. We are surrounded by countries, and here I talk about, I refer to the countries in the Guyana Shield, Suriname, Guyana, and French Guyana, and so forth. Venezuela, and who knows, in a few years, there would be Barbados, Grenada, because they're all in that sort of area where with deep sea drilling and exploration, we're likely to see a lot more oil and gas coming to the surface. And I keep asking myself, why is it strange for us to be able to negotiate with our partners, our neighbors who have excess supply, because Venezuela has a lot more gas than it needs. And we should have been negotiating a long time ago with Venezuela to supply gas. We waited quite late. Venezuela, of course, had difficulty in supplying gas because of a very nationalist approach they took over the years, not realizing that, other countries like UAE and Russia and so forth that have an excess of gas and oil tend to sell this raw material abroad. So why shouldn't they do the same thing as others? And they're in a fortunate position in that they have a market right next door. We have the industries which could absorb that gas, which is beneficial to them to some extent. But I'm not sure that we look at it that way, and we try to approach it in a process of negotiation where there could be a win-win kind of situation. So that what has occurred there with the dragon is something that probably should have started years ago. And this is basically what I would say at this point on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Dr. Tiwari, no more questions.
Okay, didn't you
Yeah.
have someone else on the, when you said you had a lineup of 3? Did they all get
No,
their
that
chance?
was, those were the questions, yeah.
All
So
right.
there
Well,
are
it's
no
now
more.
all right. Well, it's about 4 minutes to 9 now, and what I will ask each panelist, starting with in following the order that we did at first, is to ask Dr. Farrell to begin, and just in a minute or so, if you had to take a kind of summary position or give some closing remarks in a minute, what would you say? And I would ask the same of the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bo. I would just go back to my I guess my mantra that we have 3 imperatives. The imperatives of adjustment. Adjustment and stabilization means that you want to keep the plane level as level as possible while it is moving forward. And so that's adjustment. And I think that we are now in a position where we have on the external account and on the fiscal accounts, we have a degree of balance that we can move forward with. So I would say that thanks to Vladimir Putin, we have effected a degree of adjustment. The second imperative is diversification, and we've spoken about that this evening in terms of what that means and how that should be defined. We are doing some of it at the margins, but it is not sufficient. We need to be doing a great deal more in respect of diversifying the economy. That is to say, promoting the development of our non-energy exports, earning foreign exchange to be able to replace foreign exchange from the energy sector over time. And the last imperative is transformation. That is to say that we have to change the public sector. We have to reform the public sector. We have to engage in a process of constitutional change because our constitution is not working in our interests. We have all of these issues with the service commission, the teaching service commission, the public service commission, the public service itself, the question of public service pension, the overhang of that in respect of the government expenditure. Government expenditure itself needs to be reformed, and we need to reform the private sector as well. The private sector needs to be incentivized to do the things that we wanted to do, that is to say, earn foreign exchange, and to be disincentivized from the rent-seeking behaviors that we see in large sections of the private sector. I'm not going to call some of the things that we see, but it's a pervasive problem in the private sector. So we need to have an incentive structure and a disincentive structure that changes and transforms the way in which this economy works. So those are my closing remarks, Chairman. Thank you.
All right. Kevin, would you like to follow? Take a minute.
Yeah, in the context of just focusing on 2023, I don't see any significant changes in gas and oil production. In fact, oil production will continue probably to decline. Gas production will be probably flat. And of course, as we pointed out, the price environment of 2022 will not continue into 2023. Certainly for gas. The big variable for the world is the degree to which China's reopening affects the demand for oil and natural gas. So that's 2023 in a nutshell. In terms of Trinidad and Tobago long term, I agree with Dr. Farrell. We have to find a way to get the private sector excited, the local private sector excited about investing in Trinidad and Tobago, and that speaks to the structure of incentives, and it speaks to the ease of doing business, which continues to be an obstacle to progress in Trinidad and Tobago. So that will be my closing comment.
All right, good. And Professor Hussain, you have the final word here.
Yes, so in closing, before I give an economic comment, I would like to say thanks to you, Dr. Tiwari, for hosting. Thanks for all that joined us. Thanks to Rebecca, Mark Rupchan, and Christian Seeley, who do all the background work to make these seminars a success. I would just like to say, rather than add to what you all have said, I would like to suggest that policymakers take a good deep look at our labor force participation rate, take a good deep look at how we could reverse some of these terrible trends in home invasions and the murder level, and take a good deep look at the skewed impact of transfers and subsidies on the structure of the economy, so that we could recalibrate it in a manner that increases non-energy export output. I would stop with that.
Okay, on behalf of the Trade and Development Unit at the University of the West Indies, I want to thank you all for being present and for participating in this particular forum this evening, focused on what is likely to happen in 2023 and perhaps beyond. And I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Terence Farrell, Mr. Kevin Ramnarine, and Professor Roger Hussein for bringing such a reflective, thoughtful approach to their presentations, and yet at the same time speaking so plainly and forthrightly to some of the issues that we and challenges that we face, but issues also that we have to address. And I want to thank them for their contribution. To all participants, Dr. Hussein has already thanked Rebecca and Mark and others who keep the program going. But to all participants who signed on and actually entered the discussion and were part of the listening and viewing audience, I want to thank you